Good evening. It's wonderful to see all of you here, and once again, let's welcome David. It's so great to have him with us. David, thank you. So, David's biography is not something that we really need to read. Everyone knows David, but I like to read it because the man has accomplished so many amazing things. So, David, I'm going to embarrass you for a moment. David Brooks is a best-selling author, op-ed columnist at the New York Times, and recurring commentator on PBS NewsHour. The author of 6 books, David founded and currently chairs Weave, the social fabric project at the Aspen Institute. He has also been featured on NPR's All Things Considered and NBC's Meet the Press, as well as in The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and Forbes, to name a few. He has been awarded more than 30 honorary degrees, that's a lot of hoods, from American colleges and universities, and was a Jackson Senior Fellow at Yale, and he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. David has also been a wonderful friend to this cathedral over the years. Not too long ago, 5 or so years ago, he actually preached from the Canterbury pulpit, and I hate him for it because it was one of the best sermons I've ever heard, and I've been doing it for 30 years. Speaking of that, if you were to take the last 25 years of my sermons and go through them and search David Brooks, you would find dozens of quotes that I have used over the years. David Brooks once wrote, David Brooks once said, and so I thank you for, Mark, I'll switch to the other one, make it easier for you. So I thank you for all that you've done for so many.
Have you quoted Matthew, John, and Luke more than me?
No, listen, don't get that, no, not that. Nope, but close, thank you. So before we jump into the book, and we have a lot to talk about with the book, I can't help it, I'm a clergyman. I want to talk with you a little bit about your op-ed on December 19th, The Shock of Faith. I think people have a lot of interest in you talking about your faith journey. And so much of what you said resonated with many of my own faith experiences. What moved you to write that?
Frankly, the New York Times readership may not be the most religious body in the country. And so when I was hired, my editor said I was as conservative as our readers could stand. And so I thought it was important. My joke about when I was hired, I was more conservative than I am now. My joke is being a conservative columnist at the New York Times is like being the chief rabbi at Mecca. And so there's not a lot of company there. I was sort of off on the fringes. But I did have this experience over the last 10 or 15 years of coming to faith. And so I thought I wanted to try to represent it to people who may not have faith, and to try to make faith seem like something not crazy. And you know, it was a journey that happened really right around here. And so I grew up in New York, in Lower Manhattan. I went to a nice Episcopal school. I grew up in a Jewish home, and I went to a nice Episcopal school called Grace Church School, which is near the Strand Bookstore, if you know that. And I was actually in the choir. We were in the chapel every day, and I was in the choir. And because it was New York City, the choir was about 30 or 40% Jewish. And so we would sing the hymns, but to square it with our religion, we wouldn't sing the word Jesus. And so the volume in the church would drop down, and then it would come back up. And so I learned the Lord's Prayer, I learned the hymns, I learned this beautiful story of Jesus. And I grew up in a Jewish home, so I knew the Jewish story. And I had these two stories rattling around in my brain for 50 years almost. And they didn't mean much to me because I didn't believe in God. And so the stories were just nice stories. I was religious. I would go to Adas Israel Synagogue right here on Connecticut Avenue. We kept a kosher home. We sent our kids to Jewish day schools. But I didn't really have faith. And faith didn't come to me the way I expected. When you hear about faith, you hear about belief. What do you believe? Like it's some intellectual thing. But when I came to faith, first it was through numinous experiences. I had an experience, if you know Penn Station in New York City, it's the second ugliest spot on the face of the earth. The ugliest spot is the subway station next to Penn Station. And so I was on the subway car, and I was looking around, and I was searching at that moment, and it occurred to me that all the people I'd seen, like all the people in this room, had souls. They had some piece of them that has no size, weight, color, or shape, but gave them infinite value and dignity. And I just saw them, the souls were not still. I had the sensation their souls were stirring. They were soaring, some of them. They were suffering. They were sleeping. And if there is souls in each person, and I really don't, journalism doesn't make sense to me unless you believe the people you're writing about have souls. They have infinite value and dignity. Maybe there's a soul giver. And so that was swirling around, and it was sort of a swirl, and I had a whole series of these kinds of transcendent experiences, which many of us have had. And some of them were here on the Cathedral grounds. I spent a lot of time on the bench over on the North Lawn near Woodley. There was a tree on the south side, which was lit up at night in a beautiful way that I associated with the Holy Spirit. And I really spent night after night here. I was searching. And it turns out when you're searching, and that becomes known, Christians give you books. And so over the course of a couple months, several months, I had 600 books given to me, only 350 of which were different copies of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And so I was just searching and searching. And I knew a Christian, and my wife is sitting in the front row, and I would send her questions. I want to have God's grace. How do I earn God's grace? What do I have to do? She was like, nah, it doesn't really work that way. And so we'd exchange these emails, and slowly, like I'd love to say there was a moment when I was living up on Newark Street here, where God came through the wall and said, come follow me. That did not happen. But it was like you're driving in a train, you're just sitting and reading, and nothing dramatic is happening. You're reading the paper, the people around you are drinking coffee, and you look out the window and you realize that there's a lot of ground behind you, and you're a long way from atheism. And you've come into the land of belief. And so I realized I'm a believer. And to me, it's the Beatitudes are the moment where the celestial grandeur pokes through. And so round about 2013, I became a believer, and it came to me as Christianity, as Jesus. To really revere Jesus the Jew. Jesus the Jew, which I talked about in that sermon, is not the fair-haired guy with two fingers in the air. He was the guy who emerged from revolution and strife. And he went into the power structures and he upturned over all the tables at all. Jesus the Jew was a total badass. I didn't use that word in the sermon. And I think the biggest surprise for me is that faith to me doesn't feel like belief, because belief implies you possess something. Faith to me feels like a yearning, a longing, a desire for something, a desire for the infinite of which we're all a part.
A homesickness.
Yeah, like the true disease, some people call it. And so it felt like this longing, this yearning. And one of the problems Jews have with heaven is there's nothing left to do. And so for me, my favorite definition of Gregory and Nyssa, the early church leader, was that heaven is endless longing. And it turns out the thing you long for determines the nature of your longing. So if you yearn for money, you'll always be a little greedy. If you yearn for power, you'll always be insecure. But if you yearn for generosity itself, that's just a beautiful form of longing. And so it's felt like a joyous and strange adventure. But it really was getting out of my head and getting into the world. And when you come to faith, you're assenting to put your heart at the center of your life, which for a newspaper columnist is not the easiest thing. But it's been a nice journey. I really have this structure, this place, this community to really thank for.
You know, it's interesting. In our tradition, we say the Nicene Creed, every single Sunday, and each section begins with "I believe." And I think that has done more harm to people about what faith is than almost anything else. Not that I have a problem with the creed itself, but people think that to have faith means I've got to cram certain beliefs into my brain and be fine with them. When actually, if you look at the word believe within the creed, it's credo, which can also mean I give my heart to. And I think that's such a powerful idea. I give my heart to God the Father. I give my heart to God the Son. And because faith is not about intellectual assent so much as it is for me, it's about trust. And I hear that.
I wish you'd told me that 10 years ago. You would have saved me some time.
And what did C.S. Lewis said in talking about the yearning? He said, the great goal of my life has been to find the place where all the beauty came from. And I just love that line. Yeah.
And I will say, I experienced faith architecturally. Sitting there at Grace Church, a beautiful church in Manhattan, Chartres Cathedral, this place, somehow the soaring spirit of this structure, these arches.
And now I guess the subway and Penn Station are holy places for you.
Yeah, I always jump the fare because I think they owe me.
Hey, Mark, can you do me a favor? If the speakers are on the stage, will you turn them down? It's a little hard for me to hear David, and he's 4 feet from me. Thank you, my friend. Okay, so now let's jump. Thank you for that. That was a gift. I appreciate you sharing that. Now let's go and talk about how to know a person. You've had The Road to Character, The Second Mountain, and now How to Know a Person. 3 amazing books. You've talked about this before, but tell us, who do you write these books for?
Well, we writers are working out our stuff in public. And my life journey is a journey from superficiality and an attempt to get toward depth. And in this last book in particular, as I mentioned, I grew up in a Jewish home in New York City. And for those of you who are not Jews, if you saw the movie Fiddler on the Roof, you know how warm and huggy Jewish families can be. They're always laughing and dancing and singing. I come from the other kind of Jewish family. And so the saying in our family was, act British, think Yiddish. And so we tried to be clever, but very stiff upper lip, show no emotion. And so we were somewhat emotionally reserved. And there's an element, and then, I went off to the University of Chicago, which, as some of you know, a very intellectually serious place. It's not the most emotional, fun place. The saying about Chicago that everybody knows, it's where fun goes to die. My favorite saying, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so, super cerebral. The kids actually wear these T-shirts. Sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? So I fit right in at Chicago. And I had a double major while I was there in history and celibacy. And so, super intellectual. And then, so I'm living up in my head. And then I get a job as a newspaper columnist. I become a writer, which is somewhat lonely. And then I get a job on TV. And you would have thought that would loosen me up. TV's an emotional medium. But I get a job on the most intellectual part of TV, which is the PBS NewsHour. And so we do these 12-minute segments on electrification in Nigeria. And so we have a wonderful audience. It's very thoughtful. It's very deep. It's somewhat seasoned. And so if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your program, but my mother loves it. And so all which is to say I was living in my head. And that way of living is symbolized through one moment of mine that I had. My family, we're all big baseball fans. And I've been to thousands of games. I've never caught a foul ball. But one day I took my youngest son up to Baltimore to Camden Yards, and we were watching an Orioles game. And the batter loses control of the bat. It flies in the air and lands in my lap. Now, getting a bat is 1,000 times better than getting a ball. Yeah. Any normal human being is standing up in the air, waving his trophy, high-fiving everybody, hugging, getting on the Jumbotron. I took the bat and I put it on the feet and I stared straight ahead. I had the emotional reaction of a turtle. And so eventually you get to this point where you don't want to live this way. Frederick Buechner has a great line where he says that if you shut yourself off from the pains and agonies of life, you've also shut yourself off from the holy sources of life itself. And so I just wanted to get better. And some people go to therapy, but I write books. And so that first book was called The Road to Character. And I learned writing that book that actually writing a book on character doesn't give you good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. And so I recommend that. And then The Second Mountain was about my season in the Valley. And I was reading a lot of Henry Nouwen. And then this book was about hopefully trying to induce in myself a kind of emotional openness. And I can prove that it works because a couple years ago, after the book came out, or maybe a year ago, I was at a conference in Nantucket. And the guy on stage said, okay, everybody in the crowd, I'm going to hand you a piece of paper which had lyrics to a love song. And I want you to find a stranger, gaze into their eyes, and sing the love song to them. And I did it. I found some old guy, I gazed into his eyes, I sang the love songs.
What'd you sing?
I can't remember the name of the song now, but there was no chemistry between us. There were no sparks, nothing happened. So we write books in order to help ourselves out.
You know, this book it's almost a PhD level sort of inquiry into what it means to listen and be with someone else in a genuine way. At a time in our country when we have so many people who are running around acting like second graders, does it make you sad at all that we're in this place and we're so far from what you write about in this book?
Yeah, well, that was the other piece. You write for your personal reason, but you also write for society. George Orwell had a really great essay called Why I Write. And he said, I write because I want to appear clever, I love to play around with language, and I want to affect the world a little. And so as I have been taking a journey to become a little more human, unfortunately our society as a whole has been taking a journey to become more dehumanized. And so we're in the middle of a crisis which I think is relational, but I think it's also a spiritual crisis. And it shows up in the statistics. You know the mental health statistics, you know the rising suicide. 4 times as many people say they have no close personal friends than in 2000. 45% of high school students said, I feel persistently hopeless and despondent. The number of people that are romantic partners up by 1/3. The number of people who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50%. And so we've just become sadder. And when you become sadder, you become meaner. Because when you feel unseen, invisible, you perceive that first as a threat and then as an insult, which it is, and an injustice. And so you lash out. And so there are a bunch of meanness statistics, hate crimes. You look at our politics. The one that gets me is a generation ago, 2/3 of Americans gave to charity every year, and now fewer than half of all Americans give to charity each year. We've just become sadder and meaner. And so there are a lot of big stories you can tell about why that's happened. Social media, political polarization, economic inequality, and I think they all have a piece of the truth. But the one I focused on was, I don't think for a couple generations we have taught each other how to perform the basic social skills of life. Morality can seem like this big lofty thing, but basically it's being considerate toward each other in the complex circumstances of life. How to listen well, how to sit with somebody who's grieving, how to be a great conversationalist. Even something small like how to get out of a conversation gracefully. Nobody ever taught me how to do that. I remember I was at my 5th high school reunion and I didn't know how to get out of a conversation gracefully. And so my only move was, well, I got to go to the bar and get another drink. And so 20 minutes into my reunion, I'm so drunk, I have to go home. And so these are basic skills. And the apex skill is the ability to make other people feel seen, heard, and known. That's how you honor their dignity. And so I'd ask you in this room, how good are you at this? And I don't know most of you, but I can tell you you're not as good as you think you are. There's a guy who studies at the University of Texas, and he finds that when we're first meeting and having a first conversation, we accurately understand what the other person is thinking about 22% of the time. Some people are good, 55%. A lot of people are 0%, but think they're 100%. And those are the people missing all the most social cues. And so what I wanted to do, partly in the book, was to just describe the skills, how you do this, how you make people feel unheard. I want it to be practical. And so I just walk people through the different stages of how you do it, because we're in this social desert, which has caused, I think, our political dysfunction flows from a moral and social dysfunction.
So let me ask you a question. As you know, and as many folks here know, it's been an interesting week here at the Cathedral. Things have been busy, as they say. And I've been really interested at the number of emails and letters and phone calls that I've been getting around the end of Bishop Mary Ann's homily at the prayer service for the nation. There are so many emails that I have gotten that talk about what she said as being a diatribe, as being attacking, as being so regrettable, never should have happened, awful thing to do, cornering the president. And then I get so many other people who write in and say, good for her to speak gently to the president about having mercy. And two radically different understandings of what she said from good people on both sides of this. Given what you talk about in your book, how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, first I want to thank you all for coming. I was so crowded. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance couldn't get in. They were really eager to be here again. I guess as you were just speaking, I reminded of something a friend of mine who's a pastor, a Baptist pastor in Northern Virginia, said to me. He said his church has gotten so politicized, and it's about 50-50. And people more on the Trump side want to talk about politics all the time. People on the left did not want to talk about politics. And it was just hard on him. And one of the things he did sort of as a game with himself, he would take passages from the Sermon on the Mount and interject them directly into the sermon without saying where those passages came from. And on the way out, some of his congregants would say, I really liked your sermon, except for this part. That part was so woke. And so some people see the Sermon on the Mount as woke, and some people don't. And it is a problem. The core problem in the story you just told is seeing everything through a political lens. Yeah. And to me, one of the problems in our politics is it has become a religion for a lot of people. That if you leave people naked and alone, if you leave people with a sense of existential anxiety, they're going to seek some form of social therapy which will fill their void. And politics gives you the illusion that you're going to get what you get from religion or community. It gives you the illusion that you're on a team, you're a member of a community, team red, team blue. But you're not in a community, you're not serving each other, you're just hating the same people. It gives you the illusion of righteous action. But you're not sitting with the widow or serving the poor, you're just indignant on Twitter. And so politics is a failed form of social therapy, which gives you the illusion you're going to solve your loneliness and your anger and your isolation, but it just winds you in a period of culture war. And so to me, the over-politicization of life, the over-politicization of sports, of churches, of everything. If you're asking politics to fill the hole in your soul, you're asking more of politics than it can deliver. And so I think people have become over-politicized, and they want to fold what Mary Ann said was simply, I don't think it's a problem for a member of the clergy to cite the gospel, which is what she did. And that people would react shows how over-politicized we've gotten. And another friend of mine who's also a pastor said, in my church, the people who are most spiritually healthy are quiet, and the people who are spiritually loud spiritually unhealthy are loud. And I think that is part of what's happening in this country, is that public conversation is being dominated by the unhealthy tiny minority. And that's true on the right. And as someone who was teaching at Yale off and on for 20 years, it's very much true on the left.
Yeah.
That these are small minorities of people who are working out their own issues in the form of politics or in the form of religion. But it's a pretty small minority. I remember when Pope Francis first came on the scene, remember a lot of people were really taken with him, including a lot of non-Christians. And it was striking to me at that moment how much people respond to anybody who acts like Jesus. He took a guy who was deformed, and if you remember, he hugged him face to face. That's a Christological moment. And it doesn't matter what faith you have or no faith. There's something beautiful about that, and people are drawn to it. And if we can't have that kind of respect for that kind of beauty, then we really have descended into a political hellhole.
You know, that sort of political division that you talk about, or putting too much faith in our politics, it's hard here at the Cathedral when we try so hard to hold people together. You know, to hold people together from both sides, to be a house of prayer for all people. And I think a lot of churches, a lot of synagogues, a lot of communities are struggling with that. And if I could stick your book into everybody's front door, I think it would be a great gift. So let's move now to, you talk about diminishers and you talk about illuminators. And you say diminishers are defined by egotism, anxiety, naive realism, the less is mind problem, objectivism, essentialism, and the static mindset. And illuminators are described by tenderness, receptivity, active curiosity, affection, generosity, and a holistic attitude. Now, I know you could spend a lot of time explaining each one of those, but give us for those folks who may not have read your book or have just gotten it and are looking forward to it, give us an overview of what you mean there. I mean, you're talking about givers and takers, essentially, right?
Yeah, some people make you feel seen and heard and understood. They ask you questions. Sometimes I go to a party, especially in Washington, and I leave the party and I think, you know, that whole time nobody asked me a question. And I've come to believe only about 30% of humanity are question askers. And that's especially true in a city where the mother's milk is self-importance. I had a buddy, he's a good buddy of mine, and he was working the Obama administration. And I was on the phone with him, and he was talking to me about something, and I was on my cell, and the call dropped. And so I think, okay, he'll realize in 30 seconds that the call has dropped, he'll call me back. So I wait 2 minutes, and then 4 minutes, and then 6 minutes. Finally, at 8 or 10 minutes, I call his office, and his assistant says, oh, he can't come on the phone. He's on the phone already. And I said to her, no, he's on the phone with me. He's been bloviating for 10 minutes. He does not understand. And that's a good way to not see somebody, just talk at them. And so those are diminishers. Illuminators, for example, E.M. Forster was a novelist who wrote about 120 years ago, I'm guessing. And his biographer said to him, to speak to him was to be seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity, you have to be your sharpest, most honest, and best self. We'd all be able to listen with that kind of intensity. There's a story told about Jenny Jerome, who was later became Winston Churchill's mom. Though she was a young woman in Victorian England, she was at a dinner party, and she was seated next to the Prime Minister, William Gladstone. And she left that dinner thinking that Gladstone was the cleverest person in England. A couple weeks later, she's at another dinner. She happens to be seated next to Gladstone's great political rival, Benjamin Disraeli. And she leaves that dinner thinking that she's the cleverest person in England. So it's nice to be Gladstone. It's better to treat people the way Disraeli did. So it's that ability to be intensely curious, to care about what other people think, to ask them questions. And you leave those people and you think, that person was just a good question asker, a pretty good listener. And it may not have a big effect, but I think a lot of the reason, frankly, a lot of the people support Donald Trump is because they look at the media, they look at the universities, they look at the corridors of power, and they don't see themselves. We've created a pretty effective segregation system. So I work at a great newspaper. I'm around a lot of people in the great media organizations. I'm not aware of one Trump supporter among the editorial staff of any of these places. And I would say that's pretty much true of universities. And so if you look in the mirror of society and you're not there, you're going to be angry. And I think a lot of what's happening is a result of that sense of rejection.
In that vein, I'd love for you to read what I think is such a beautiful part of the beginning of your book on page 16, if you'd read about beholding. Since your lovely bride is sitting right out there right now.
16, no, this is 9. Okay, I'll read this. I'm embarrassed to do this with Anne right there. Okay, here we go. One day, not long ago, I was reading a dull book at my dining room table when I looked up and I saw my wife framed in the doorway of our house. The door was open. The late afternoon sun was streaming in around her. Her mind was elsewhere, but her gaze rested on a white orchid that we kept in a pot on the table by the door. I paused. I should mention that she was standing there in that doorway with the light streaming in behind her, and she didn't even notice I was there in the room, because that's the kind of charisma I have. I paused and looked at her with a special attention and had a strange and wonderful awareness ripple across my mind. I know her, I thought. I really know her. I know her through and through. If you had asked me what it was exactly that I knew about her in that moment, I would have had trouble answering. It wasn't any collection of facts about her or life story or even something expressible in words I'd use to describe her to a stranger. It was the whole flowing of her being, the incandescence of her smile, the undercurrent of her insecurities, the rare flashes of fierceness, the vibrancy of her spirit. It was the lifts and harmonies of her music. I wasn't seeing pieces of her or having specific memories. What I saw, or felt I saw, was the wholeness of her, how her consciousness creates her reality. It's what happens when you've been with someone for a while, endured and delighted together, and slowly grown in an intuitive sense for how that person feels and responds. It might even be accurate to say that for a magical moment, I wasn't seeing her, I was seeing out from her. Perhaps to really know another person, you have to have a glimmer of how they experience the world. To really know someone, you have to know how they know you. The only word I can think of in the English language that captures my mental processes at that instant is beholding. She was at the door, the light blazing in behind her, and I was beholding her. They say there is no such thing as an ordinary person. When you're beholding someone, you're seeing the richness of this particular human consciousness, the full symphony, how they perceive and create their life. I don't have to tell you how delicious that moment felt. Warm, intimate, and profound. It was the bliss of human connection. And I should say that I told this story after it happened to a friend of ours, this concept of beholding. And he said, they said, yeah, that's how we look at our grandchildren. We're not observing them, we're not inspecting them, we're just beholding. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful moment.
That is a beautiful way that you have described it too. And for me, from a theological point of view, I think it illustrates so beautifully what it means to move away from sin to sort of a reconciliation. That, as Christians, we believe that sin really is separation. We're separated from God, we're separated from our true selves, we're separated from one another. And that overcoming sin is a process of overcoming that separation. And in a very fundamental way, Christ does that with his life and his death. But I thought the way you described that beholding, if we could look at each person in that kind of way, that to me would be the kingdom of God, just about.
Yeah, and I do think when you go through the Bible, you realize how many dramas of misrecognition where people don't see each other.
Right.
Jacob, or the disciples not recognizing the risen Christ, or the parable of the Good Samaritan. Everybody sees the guy on the side of the road, the injured guy, but only the Samaritan really sees him, sees with the eyes of the heart. And this is expressed constantly throughout the Bible with the images of light, of vision, I see, I know. And in many ways, the biblical language is wiser than our language now. We draw this bifurcation, we think of knowing as an intellectual act. But of course in the Bible, to know is an intellectual act. But it's also to enter into covenant with, to have sex with, to be in community with. It's a whole body experience. And so to see, because I'm a deep and profound person, my knowledge of Christianity comes from a miniseries called The Chosen. I don't know if anybody's watched this series, but I recommend it. Most movies and TV shows about religious subjects are terrible. I remember Ann and I once saw a movie about Paul, and I was like, I used to be a movie critic. I was like, good for Christian. Like, it's a low bar. But this is a genuinely good series called The Chosen.
Was he a white guy too?
Well, yeah, but
Paul?
he spoke in this vaguely Hebraic accent. So that seems authentic to me. Because I think Jesus actually spoke English with a vaguely Israeli accent. But the way
King James English.
Yeah, the way the character looks, that's the one thing. He's a great actor, actually. It's how he looks at people when he's not talking. You see the power of a gaze. I'll tell one quick story, and this is about the power of the gaze. So I'm in Waco, Texas, for this weave project I'm a part of. And I'm having breakfast with a 93-year-old lady named LaRue Dorsey. And she presents herself to me as this fierce drill sergeant. She'd been an educator most of her life, and she was like, I loved my students enough to be tough with them. And I was a little intimidated by this formidable old lady. And into the diner walks a mutual friend of ours, a pastor named Jimmy Durrell. And Jimmy pastors to the homeless in Waco. The homeless were not comfortable coming to his church, so he moved his church to under a highway overpass where the homeless live, and that's where he has his service. And he sees us both, and he walks up to our table, and he grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders, and he shakes her way harder than you should ever shake a 93-year-old. And he says to her, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best, I love you, I love you. And that tough drill sergeant I'd been talking to turns in an instant into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. With the power of his gaze and his attention, he brought forth a different version of her. And it's part because he's a warmer personality than I am, but it's part because he sees someone made in the image of God. He sees someone so important that Jesus was willing to die for this person. And so the power of the gaze is just so important. Simone Weil was a Jewish mystic in World War II, and she says, attention is the ultimate act of generosity. Iris Murdoch, the philosopher who learned a lot from Simone Weil, said, usually we see the world with self-centered eyes, but our goal should be to cast a just and loving attention on others. And it's the power of attention that is the basis of morality. If you see someone with suspicious eyes, you'll see threat. If you see someone with loving and generous eyes, you'll see someone doing the best they can. So it's that power of attention. I read this somewhere recently in a book that Mother Teresa was being interviewed by Dan Rather. And Rather asked her, when you pray to God, what are you saying to him? And she says, I'm not really saying anything, I'm just listening. And Dan Rather says, well, what is God saying to you? And she says, well, he's not saying anything either, he's just listening. And if I can't explain it, I don't know what to do. So that power of attention is just so central to who we are as humans.
And where is it? Is it an African culture, I think, where they believe that you don't exist until someone else sees you?
Yeah. I've forgotten. There's a Swahili name for that. For that, I don't remember it.
You know, you also, on the flip side that I was talking about of separation and reconciliation, you say really clearly that evil happens when people are unseeing, when they don't recognize the personhood in another human being. And then you go on to say, the essence of evil is the tendency to obliterate the humanity of another.
Yeah, there was a book called Machete Season that came out after the Rwandan genocide. And a French journalist went down to Rwanda after the genocide and started interviewing the people who'd committed it. And he's interviewing somebody who had macheted and decapitated his neighbor of 25 years. And he asked the guy, what was it like when you did it? And he said, at that moment, he did not look like the person I'd been living next to all those years. His face got blurry, and he just had no features. And that's that's what dehumanization is, to not see the face. And as someone, you know, like anybody in semi-public life, you get attacked. And as soon as you turn around and treat the other person with civility and generosity, the attacks stop. As soon as they realize another human being at the end of their attack, they immediately turn into the kind of person they are most of the time, which is kind and generous. So it's that rekindling, that sparkling of, yeah, I'm a person, you're a person, what are we going to do here? And it's magical that it turns around in an instant, no matter how nasty they've been in their email or whatever comment it was that they approached you with.
You know, what's the old saying, it's almost impossible to hate someone when you've heard their story?
And I would say that one of the ways we can all do better in the world is to do that. And so one of the ways, I have a buddy named Nick Epley, who's a psychologist at the University of Chicago. And we were doing an event like this. And we're about 45 minutes into it, and then he says, okay, you in the audience, we're now going to shut up here. I want you to find a stranger, and I want you to, for the next 10 minutes, tell them about the high point of your life, the low point of your life, and the turning point of your life. And there's a big groan that goes up across the crowd. And he says, how many of you don't want to do this? And 80% of the hands go up. And he says, go. And so for the next 10 minutes, they all find a stranger and they start telling the intimate stories of their life. And after 10 minutes, we can't get them to shut up. And after 20 minutes, finally we bring them back to attention, and he says, how many of you enjoyed that? And 80% of the hands go up. And one of his research findings is that we underestimate how much we'll enjoy talking to strangers. We underestimate how deep people want to go fast. And we don't do it enough. And so I don't always do that. I try to live up to my word, but I don't always. But some of the time when I'm on a flight, I'll put my headphones in and work for the first chunk of it. But then when there's been an hour left in the flight, I'll take the headphones out. I don't want to have too long a conversation with the person, but an hour I can handle. And so we'll talk for the last hour of the flight. And there's never been a time where I remembered my reading more than I remembered the conversation. I was with a guy, it was a short flight from JFK down to DCA. And he was an older guy, and he was a big Trump supporter. He'd come to America from Russia when he was a kid. He swept floors, he started a company. He'd divorced 90 or 800 times. He'd started companies that had been bankrupt. He showed me his vacation photos with him and a bunch of very good-looking young people on a yacht. I didn't quite know where that came from. And he wasn't my cup of tea. But it was fascinating to hear the guy tell the story of his life. And I've never met anybody whose life story is boring. And when you do this, you realize that nobody fits into the stereotype we have of them. Years ago, I encountered a woman who was a big Trump supporter, who was, let's see if I can remember this, a lesbian biker who converted to Sufi Islam after surviving a plane crash. It's like, what stereotype do you fit into? That's the way human beings are.
And that's also the essence of community, isn't it? I mean, and in our culture today, there's such a lack of community. I always say that the church or the synagogue or the mosque or the temple is one of the last places where people can find intergenerational community, right? And when we can listen to one another's stories, it's an amazing thing, amazing thing. Let me ask you a question. So I want to move in something a little bit more philosophical for a moment. You spend a fair amount of time in the first part of the book talking about how to define what a person is and what some of the things that makes it difficult for us to do this with each other. Because you say that a person is a point of view, essentially, that a person is defined by their own experiences which are unique to them. Every person you meet is a creative artist who takes the events of life and over time creates a very personal way of seeing the world, which I would agree with. But I have to ask, does that lead to subjectivism and relativism if each of us are trapped in our own subjective experiences?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. But it's a very good question. I'm glad you asked me. This is something I never get asked about. So, yeah, one of the things I have a little hobby, and I love to talk to neuroscientists, because that's the kind of fun party guy I am. And one of the things you learn from those is we really do construct our realities. And so there's no such thing as sound and color out in the universe. That's all something we construct in here. And so, for example, we who speak English, when we see a rainbow, we see a 7-banded rainbow. There are no bands on a rainbow. It's just a continuum of light. But our mind constructs that. And Russians have 2 different words for blue, light blue and dark blue. And so they don't see a 7-banded rainbow. They see an 8-banded rainbow, because those are the concepts in their head. Another experiment done by a guy at the University of Virginia, he asked people to estimate how steep the hills on campus were. And people tend to overestimate. A hill might be a 5% grade, they estimate 20%. But one day the research results came back and the students got it exactly right. That's a 5% grade. And they wondered, how on earth did they suddenly get it right? It turns out that day they had interviewed the members of the women's soccer team. And so they were very fit D1 athletes. And so walking up a hill was no problem for them. And so the way you see the hill depends on what you can do in that circumstance. So heavy people see steeper hills than non-heavy people. People with backpacks see steeper hills than non-heavy. Not people without backpacks. People who have listened to sad songs see steeper hills. So it's all very relative. But that does not mean objective truth doesn't exist. The hill is right there. You can measure it. Right. And so my view is that we have only subjective access to objective reality. Yeah. And so there is such a thing as truth. And if I could take it to another philosophical level, I think one of the problems we have, and one of the roots of our spiritual crisis, is a diminishing of the awareness of a sense of objective truth. There's a great historian, George Marsden, who wrote about Martin Luther King. What gave such force to his preaching was the sense that right and wrong were woven into the fabric of the universe. That if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. If segregation is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. There is an eternal moral order, and that mercy, grace, justice, kindness, these are not just relative things. They're anchors in the moral compass of the universe around which you can organize your life. And over the last 60 years, as our societies have become more individualized, we tell young people, come up with your own moral viewpoint. Come up with your own morality. Come up with your own point of view. And if your name is Aristotle, maybe you can do that. Most of us can't do that. But we've essentially privatized morality. And we've taken morality from a common shared good that becomes the source of all our community. And we assume that morality is just a matter of individual taste. And I'm reminded of a book a great columnist named Walter Lippmann wrote, I think around 1955. He saw this coming. And he said, if morality is just what each individual decides to feel and believe on the basis of their own opinions, then we are outside the bounds of civilization. And that book was hooted down, but I think he was absolutely right. One of my favorite concepts in psychology is from a guy named John Bowlby, who was an attachment theorist in the 50s. And his teaching was that all of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. We need that secure base, and that secure base is the attachment to our family. It's an attachment to a place, but it's also an attachment to an eternal moral order that gives us a sense of security. And if you take away that secure base, then we just shut down, we get nasty, and we go to a place of existential anxiety. And as Hannah Arendt, the philosopher in the same era, said, all fanaticism derives from existential anxiety. If you make people feel insecure, threatened, and dangerous to the depth of their soul, then they will flock to authoritarians.
And tell the story about, I loved how I thought it was brilliant the way you talked about Reinhold Niebuhr and Carl Rogers at the end of the Second World War, and that there were two very definite ways of looking at things, and we followed one path versus another.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has puzzled me is when this country was founded, our founders looked around at us, human beings, and they said, these people are wonderfully made, but deeply selfish. And if we're going to build it, they understood that democracy required more public virtue than any other system of government. If we're going to build a system of democracy, we have to obsess about moral formation. And so they filled the society with morally formative institutions. The Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, there were things in the, one of my heroes is a woman named Frances Perkins, who went to Mount Holyoke in 1905, and that was a morally formative institution. They had rules there that probably wouldn't fly at a college today. Freshmen shall bow in the presence of sophomores. Probably wouldn't work. But they had a phrase at Mount Holyoke, go where no one wants to go and do what no one wants to do. And if you looked at the people who went abroad, they send these young women after graduation to Africa, across Asia, all around the world to do service work and missionary work. They were just like shot out of a cannon. My favorite summary of what moral formation comes from is from the Gospel of Ted Lasso. And he's asked in his first season there, what's your goal for your soccer team? And he says, my goal is not to win championships. My goal is to help these fellas become the best versions of themselves on and off the field. That's moral formation. We're just trying to help people around us become the best version of themselves on and off the field. And there was a headmaster at a school called the Stowe School in England, and he said, our job is to turn out students who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. So the kind of people you can count on when the chips are down. And so these were throughout all forms of American life. And then after World War II, it goes away. And there are histories of moral formation in America. Schools start focusing on how to get kids into college, not really how to form morally formed people. And I used to teach moral formation at Yale. And I would tell the students, you guys are good people. You have no moral vocabulary at all. If you don't understand concepts like sin, redemption, and grace, forgiveness, it's really hard to know how to be morally formed. So what shifted in our culture to make that all go away? And to me, it was surprising. It was before the generations had a real concept that we're broken people, we're sinful creatures. Right after World War II, there's a book by a guy named Joshua Liebman called Peace of Mind that says human beings are not sinful. We are good inside. We are innately good and beautiful inside. And that book sat on the #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 52 weeks. Then along comes How to Win Friends and Influence People, that sells the same message. People are good. People are good. Sits on the bestseller list, holds the record 99 weeks at #1. Then along comes Carl Rogers, who's somewhat forgotten today, but was the most influential psychologist of the 20th century. And he took this to the next level. That inside we have this beautiful, good piece of ourselves, and all we need to do is self-actualize. And he's the father of the self-esteem movement. And so instead of telling people, you really need to work on yourself, it was like, you do you, you be you, you're good. The problem is not you, the problem is institutions. And so if you think you're good, you don't need to do moral formation. You just need people be as self-centered as they can possibly be. And so all the institutions that were in the moral formation business got into the self-actualization business. And so I think we left generations morally untrained. Wanting well is not come naturally. Wanting what's worth wanting, the beautiful things, you got to be trained in that. I'll just tell one final quick story in this answer, because my mentor, Jim Lehrer, lived a couple blocks from here. And when I first started on the NewsHour, I was a young baby pundit. And when I said something that Jim liked, and he was the host, his eyes would crinkle with pleasure. And when I said something he didn't like, his mouth would turn down with displeasure. And so for 10 years, I just tried to chase the eye crinkle and avoid the mouth downturn. And he never said anything to me. It was just those smallest gestures. And he said, and it was those small gestures that said, this is how we do things here at the NewsHour. And he didn't just teach me, he taught the whole team. And so Jim's been dead, I don't know how many years now, several, maybe 7 or 8, 9, I don't know. But the Jim Lehrer moral ecology is still there at the NewsHour. And it's a great thing to have created a moral ecology that survives you. And that was just done by the little smallest gestures, not by preaching. Sorry.
Just a personal witness is what it was. So thank you. I appreciate you answering that, because I thought what you said there was brilliant. Let's turn now from all my questions to taking some questions from folks in the audience. I think Margaret has some questions for us. Thank you. Great question to begin with. At a societal level, what do you think it will take to shift us out of this culture of anger and disconnection?
Well, this week hasn't helped. I guess when I'm feeling gloomy, I recall in the middle of COVID, I read a book by Samuel Huntington, who was a great political scientist, called The Politics of Disharmony. And in this book, which he wrote in 1981, he says, I've noticed this weird pattern about American history. Every 60 years, he wrote, we tend to go through what he calls a moral convulsion. These are periods where people get disgusted with established power. Everybody wants to burn the system down. A passionate young generation comes on the scene, new forms of communication technology, and it just seems like turmoil and decay, we're all falling apart. And he said this happened in the 1770s with the Revolutionary period. It happened in the 1830s with the Jacksonian period. It happened in the 1890s with the Industrial Revolution leading to the Progressive period. And it happened in the 1960s. And we forget how terrible the 60s were. The assassinations, the riots. There were 4,000 bombings on college campuses in 1971. And he says, writing in 1981, he says, I don't know if I believe in these cycles, but if they come true, then sometime around 2020, America will go through a moral convulsion. And it was 2020 when I was reading this. I was like, good call, Samuel Huntington. And the good news is that we come out of them. That it's really hard to be hate-filled for a long period of time. Like in the 60s, they were screaming at everybody, and the professors were hated, and there were riots and everything. And then by 1974, people are into Crystal and Est and New Age. And so the point is, these moments of moral convulsion are moments when people we have a culture, and it stops working for us. And we need to chop it up. And those periods of chopping are hard to live through. But human beings are creative and ingenious. And culture is our collective response to the problems of the moment. And so if you go back to the yearbooks of 1965, high school yearbook, you look at the guys, they all have crew cuts and short hair. Then if you look at the yearbooks in 1968, half of them have short hair, half of them have long hair. By 1974, they all have long hair. And that was a shift in culture, from a more conformist culture to a more individualistic culture. And that's what we need to do in the 60s. Now we have to move from an individualistic culture to a more communal culture. And in my view, what we're having is a big fight over what sort of communal culture we want to have. And so the social justice movements, which people call wokeism, that was a version of community. It was a moral story about community redemption. MAGA is a version of community. It's a moral story about national redemption. And these two stories contradict each other, and in my view, they're both flawed in very serious ways. But so I think what you see in America right now is us trying to gravitate towards some different form of community. And so I just look at the American history, and that we tend to come out of them. We tend to eventually settle on a solution that's amenable, but it's just super rough to get there.
Here's another one. Please talk about your organization that fosters communication among people of various backgrounds and how folks can get involved.
Okay. Well, the one that comes immediately to mind is called Braver Angels. And Braver Angels was started, one of the guys who originally started it was a marriage therapist, so that helps. And they do some very clever and interesting things. One of the things they do is, first of all, you really have to guard your language. And so there are a lot of conversation groups and civil conversation groups, and 99% of them are blue people talking to each other about how it's important to bridge divides. But Braver Angels has a Republican for every Democrat, so they really get both people in. And you've really got to be careful. Like, there are symbols that a lot of us don't see that are off-putting to the other side. So, for example, they learned the word dialogue. To a lot of Reds, Republicans, it reads as, "You're about to harangue me." So they don't use the word dialogue. And so there's a lot of that goes on. And then they've, for example, at some of the meetings, they have people say, I'm going to tell you what I think. If I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, I'm going to tell you the stereotypes you have about me. So it's not like you naming me your stereotypes about me, it's me naming them. And they get them on the table in the same way. And then they've learned that, weirdly, one of the ways to get people to bridge differences is to have an argument. They have debates, but they do it in an Oxford-style way. So we're not arguing with each other, we're addressing the chair, as they do in the Oxford Debating Union. And we can honestly talk about our differences. And at the end of the weekend, the way they do is they'll go into a town, scan social media, see who's really crazy, and they'll bring them together. And then at the end of the weekend, the people say, well, of course, we came together. We're the moderates. And the Braver Angels people want to say, no, you're the crazies. And it tends to work once, as you say, once you hear somebody else's story. So that's one, I would say. But then this Weave group that I lead, we basically take people who we go to a neighborhood and we say, who's trusted here? And when you do that, people will reel off names, and often they'll reel off the same names. There are certain people in every neighborhood who are trusted. So there was a guy in Columbia Heights who, when we asked who's trusted in this neighborhood, there's a guy who takes money at the parking garage, one of the parking lots, and apparently the guy has a hobby of studying city zoning regulations. So if you have a problem with a city, you go to the guy in the parking garage. And he was the trusted guy. There was a lady, I remember we were in Florida, and she was helping kids leave school, elementary school kids, across the street after school. And one of our Weave members asked her, do you have time to volunteer in your community? And she said, no, I have no time. And we said, are you getting paid for this? She said, no, I just help the kids cross the street. And then they said, what are you doing for the rest of the day? And she said, well, on Thursdays I take food to the hospitals so the patients will have some good food to eat. And they said, well, do you have time to volunteer? And she said, no, I have no time at all. And to her, that wasn't volunteering. It was just being a neighbor. And so what we find in these areas is that people come together around a common love. And across red and blue at this local level, when it's just like, let's fix up this park. People love a place. People come together around a common project. In the book of Genesis, the creation of the universe is like 9 verses. In the book of Exodus, the creation of the tabernacle is hundreds of verses. They're unbelievably boring. Why do they have hundreds of verses? Well, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said it's because Moses was taking a fractious people, and he needed to give them a common project. They had to build this tabernacle together. So you give people a common love, a common story, and a common project, and community organizations all around every town in this country are bringing together reds and blues. They're not self-conscious about it. Right. They're just, we love our town, and they're there.
Thank you. Here's another great question. What time do we have here? We got a little bit longer. What advice do you have to millennials and Gen Z who are entering adulthood in the midst of this difficult time?
I guess I would just say, first, give yourself some grace. I've learned this. I have millennial and Gen Z children. It's really hard to be that young right now.
Yeah.
I think it's hard because of the mental health crises. It's hard. I felt like when I got to college that there were like 4 jobs, like teacher, journalist, lawyer, pastor. Now there are 8 million jobs. When I went to high school, I'm old enough to remember when I went to high school, we dated. You would ask a girl out, she might say yes, and then we didn't use the phrase going steady, but we sort of went steady. Now, mating has become chaotic.
Yeah.
Nobody knows where they stand. And one of the disturbing trends to me is that when you ask people, do you trust your neighbors, which I cited earlier, among boomers, 60% still trust their neighbors. Among millennial and Gen Z, 19%.
Wow.
If you ask Gen Z, do you agree with the following statement? Most people are selfish and out to get you. 75% of Gen Z say that. So they have grown up, and part of that's, if you ask them, why are you so distrustful? They'll point to the financial crisis, they'll point to Iraq, other things. But one of my students said, have you looked at our social lives? I had 4 boyfriends in my life, and at the end, all 4 of them ghosted me. They didn't have the decency to have a breakup conversation. And I think it's because nobody told them how. And so, of course, she's distrustful. So I would say, look, take your time. And as parents of millennial and Gen Z, endure. Let them go to 32 and then crack down. But then the final thing I'll say is, and I've taught many courses to this age group on this, and one of the courses, my students call my courses Therapy with Brooks, because we just sit around the table and spill our guts to each other. But one of the courses, the one that I'm proudest of, was on 4 commitments. The idea is if you're 22, over the next 15 years of your life, you're going to make 4 big commitments, probably, to a vocation, a career, to a community, a place to live, to a philosophy or faith, and to a marriage or some kind of family structure. And so how you make these 4 big commitments are really going to have a huge effect on your life. And so making a commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure around it so that commitment lasts. Jews love their God. They keep kosher just in case. So it's that building the structure. And at Yale, the kids are all high achievers, so they all want to talk about career. And so I always say, think about the marriage decision. And they don't want to talk about marriage. They think, one of my students said, marriage is a box that'll come in the mail when I'm 35. I was like, no. It's one of the more important decisions you're going to make. And I'm going to give you a little summary of a little sermon I give to my students on how to make the marriage decision. The first thing, I read this somewhere, I think it's from Nietzsche, who I don't think was a romantic guy. But he said, marriage is a 50-year conversation. Pick someone you can talk to for the rest of your life. Another one is that love comes and goes, but admiration stays. Pick someone you can admire. And then finally, the Greeks said there were 3 kinds of love. There's eros, which is passion. There's philia, which is friendship. And there's agape love, self-giving love. If you only have eros for this person, that's a hookup, not a marriage. If you have philia, that's friendship, not a marriage. You got to have all 3. And so these are my little sermons. But it's that sense of you got to be preparing, even if you're 25 and you're not going to be making that decision in a while. Think seriously about the big commitments because they are the foundation stones of your life.
Thank you. So as a last question, I hope everyone will buy a copy of your book if they haven't yet, if they haven't read it. It's incredible. And I think there are still some signed copies, I think, on sale in the back. So I'll do the pitch, so you don't have to do the pitch. But let's say, what do you want people to do with the book? In other words, take it home, read it, digest it, and what do you hope will come out of that?
I mean, the simplest thing is better conversations. And so like having conversation, like I know everybody in this room was once a really good conversationalist because you were all once really good question askers. And I know that because you're all former 3-year-olds. Kids are phenomenal question askers. I just read a book called The Hungry Mind about 3-year-old curiosity, and the average 3-year-old asks about 107 questions an hour. And we've all endured that. And then they get to first grade, and the teacher says, we don't have time for questions, we're learning here, because they need to stay on course. But still, kids still want to ask questions. I have a friend I write about in the book named Naomi Way, who was teaching journalism to 7th grade boys in New York City. And she says to them, I'm teaching you to interview people. I'll sit up in the front of the class, and you ask me whatever you want, and I will answer it honestly. This is the first time she ever taught this course. And so the first boy said, are you married? And she said, no. And the second boy said, are you divorced? She said, yes. And the third boy said, do you still love him? She was like, whoa. And she started crying and said, yes. And the next boy said, does he know you still love him? Do your kids know you still love him? Like a boom, 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 they're hammering her with questions. So the one thing you could take away is, like, at the next dinner party, take an okay conversation and make it an extraordinary conversation by asking some big question. So, like, if this 5 years is a chapter in your life, what's the chapter about? What transition are you in the middle of? What would you do if you weren't afraid?
That's a great one.
I had a friend who was like, he was being interviewed for a job, and at the end of the interview, he turns around the interviewer. He said, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And she started crying because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company. And I used to ask this student, my Yale students, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And every year after class, one or two would come up to me and say, I wouldn't be at Yale. It's not the right school for me, but I'm afraid to leave the prestige. And so these are just questions that get people to step back from their life and think about it. I have a question my wife really does not like. I phrased it badly when I first started asking it. The way I first phrased it was, how did the dead show up in your life? Which is a little intimidating. But the better question is, how do your ancestors show up in your life? Mm-hmm. We're all formed by our ethnic heritage, by our family background. How does that show up? So I think I remember a Dutch couple, and they talked about how Dutch heritage shapes them. African-American couple, how the black experience has shaped how they see the world. I sometimes talk about the 5,000 years of Jewish history, which is a scintillating 2 hours for most people. And so it's just to go and have, ask a bigger question, and you'll create a memorable conversation, and it'll be fun.
Well, David, I want to thank you for all the gifts that you have given us over the years with your columns and your books and the way you make us all think and lift us to a better place. You're a good friend of this cathedral and someone we admire, and we're so grateful for the work that you do, and we hope you'll keep doing it. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you. Thank you.
Restroom, anything?